It was nearly midnight when Walter Brinley, a wiry, sun-weathered man of 63, was finishing up his shift on the north pasture of Danner Creek Farm, a third-generation wheat operation tucked between the dusty knolls and rusted windmills of western Kansas. The night was quiet, save for the mechanical whir of the Massey-Ferguson combine still warm from harvest and the distant chirp of crickets fighting for territory in the wheat stubble, but Walter, who had worked more seasons than he cared to count, couldn't shake the strange pressure building behind his ears, like the rumble of a storm that never came. He paused near the old windbreak, wiping sweat from his brow with a frayed bandana, and glanced up just as something streaked across the sky, not a meteor, not a plane, but a pulse of light that shimmered without direction, humming low like an electrical surge, then flared blinding white and vanished. Walter had no time to react before his legs went out from under him, and the world went black as a low tremor rippled through the ground and seemed to stop his heart for half a second. He remembered the smell of hot earth, something like singed grass and ozone, and a single image burning behind his eyelids, a glowing oval, spinning slow, too low to be a drone, too quiet to be a helicopter, too wrong to make any sense at all. When he came to, he was lying on his back in the same pasture, right beside the hay rake he'd left hours ago, his wristwatch stuck at 12:03 a.m. and the combine now stone-cold despite no fuel cut. There wasn't a mark on his body, but Walter felt hollowed out, as if a full night had passed through him like wind through cornrows. Thinking it had been a dream or maybe heatstroke, he stumbled to his truck, drove the half-mile back to the farmhouse, and told no one, not even his grown daughter Dana who helped with accounting for the co-op, nor Boyd, the ranch hand who ran the milking schedule, telling himself it had just been a weird night, maybe something with the fertilizer fumes or lack of sleep, until 3 days later, walking the edge of the southern hayfield, he saw something that stopped him cold, an enormous perfect circle pressed into the hay, nearly 30 feet across, the blades bent but not broken, curved with precision he'd only seen in crop spiral photos on grocery store tabloids. And though Walter had lived long enough to dismiss most of what passed for mystery in the modern world, he stood there breathing shallow and muttering, "Lord Almighty," under his breath as a crow cawed once overhead and a low breeze moved through the wheat like a sigh. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, no sign of heavy machinery, just the circle and a faint burn mark along the eastern edge where the hay looked darkened as if touched by flame but left unsinged. And he didn't call the sheriff or the news or even the agricultural rep from Hayes because something in his gut told him that this wasn't something to be understood or explained, just something to be watched. For the next week, Walter checked the field every morning before coffee and every evening before supper, and each time, the mark remained unchanged, no birds nesting near it, no cattle straying into its boundaries, as if the land itself had agreed to keep it secret, and it would have stayed just a strange private omen if not for the call he got from Elmer Cates, a retired grain inspector who'd worked the co-op for 30 years and now lived up in Ogallala. Elmer was rambling about a new book he'd read on microwave radiation in crop formations and casually asked if Walter still had that oddly behaving pasture on the south line. Walter hadn't told a soul about the circle, so how Elmer knew anything sent a fresh shiver up his back, and he hung up fast, palms sweating like he was back in his high school debate finals. The next day, the circle was gone, not in the sense of flattened hay springing upright, but in the eerie way where one knows something was there and now isn't, like a scar wiped off skin or a footprint erased from snow. The hay had regrown or been shifted, impossible for the time past, and Walter stood with his arms slack, wondering if he was slipping into dementia or if something had erased the evidence purposefully. Still he said nothing, not even when the cows started avoiding the northeast pasture and his dog Red refused to cross the hedgerow after sundown, and not even when he found a strange object 2 weeks later tucked behind the water tank near the irrigation spigot, a metallic shard no bigger than a fingernail, warm to the touch despite lying in the shade all morning, smooth on one side and scorched on the other like it had torn loose from something flying too fast and not meant for this world. Walter didn't turn it in or show it to anyone, just put it in an old Prince Albert tin and hid it in the false bottom of his grandfather's toolbox, trying to move on with harvest and hay cuttings and seed prep, until the second incident happened. On the night of July 19th, during a moonless dusk, Walter swore he saw movement in the north field again, not light this time, but a shape, large and silent, gliding just above the wheat like a shadow refusing to cast itself. He ran out, breath tight in his chest, but found nothing but a broken fence post and the cows huddled against the barn, silent as ghosts, eyes fixed on a spot in the sky where nothing remained, nothing, that is, except for the sound of the Massey Ferguson's engine trying to start on its own. even though the keys were inside the house on the hook next to the pantry door. It was then Walter finally told Dana, who listened with her usual banker's calm and said it was probably old diesel lines leaking or a rat chewing wires, but that didn't explain the heat signatures on the combined seat, or the circular path of compressed wheat they found again 2 mornings later, a second sign now 50 yards north of the first, and this time accompanied by something new, a deep hum in the ground that only Walter could feel, a low tremble beneath his boots, like standing too close to a working generator. This hum never came when others were near, and Walter began to wonder whether he was chosen or cursed, guardian or fool. Even Boyd started noticing things: tools moved overnight, a spooked horse refusing to graze, odd pulses on the electric fencing with no known cause. And still no one said the word, no one dared to call it what it might be, because admitting it might turn it real, and in these parts, reality was hard enough without adding space ghosts or flying machines. Walter kept logs, quiet and methodical, tracking wind speed, soil temperature, odd smells, animal behavior, but what troubled him most was what he found near the granary on August 2nd, etched into the side of the old cement foundation, partially obscured by creeping ivy, was a symbol that hadn't been there before: 2 intersecting arcs and a spiral at the center, drawn in what looked like iron oxide, rusted deep into the stone like a brand from the earth itself. He stared at it until the sun dipped below the hill, and for the first time in 30 years, he left the field without checking the irrigation timers. In the days following the discovery of the symbol carved into the granary foundation, Walter Brinley's behavior shifted in small but unmistakable ways that didn't escape the notice of those closest to him. He began wearing his old army field jacket even in the afternoon heat, kept his Winchester rifle cleaned and loaded in the truck at all times, and started sleeping in the recliner closest to the living room window rather than his bedroom upstairs, telling Dana it was just his back acting up. Again, though she knew better, just as she noticed the lock he'd installed on the shed out by the windmill where he now spent hours each evening with his notebooks, portable radio, and what she suspected was the strange object he refused to talk about. Dana didn't press too hard. Her father was a quiet man, made quieter still by decades of heartbreak and harvests. But after that last night when she saw him walk barefoot out into the northern field and stand perfectly still for almost an hour under a sky without stars, she knew something had changed permanently. Meanwhile, word was starting to ripple through the surrounding farms. Little whispers passed between hands at the co-op and inside the checkerboard aisles of Miller's Feed and Grain, where folks said the Andersons' border collie refused to come inside anymore, and Jim Morrison, not the singer, but the retired tractor parts dealer, claimed to have seen a floating shimmer near his corn bin that made his pacemaker skip and the radio in his Buick go dead. No one tied it to Walter directly, but the old Brinley place started getting visitors. First a pair of college kids in a dusty Subaru asking about soil conductivity and infrared scans, then a lean man with a southern accent and laminated credentials claiming to be with the State Water Commission, though Walter pointed out they hadn't had a water visit in 8 years and this man had no clipboard, just a silver device in his pocket that blinked every few seconds and made red bark until he had to be chained by the barn. Walter told him to get off the property or he'd use the rifle he now kept leaning beside the porch swing, and the man didn't argue, just smiled too long and walked back to his vehicle, a nondescript gray van with no plates, then disappeared down the gravel road without a sound, not even the crunch of tires. Later that week, Walter returned to the circle. Yes, a third one had formed, this time deeper in the pasture, and crouched in the center with his boots dug into the bent stalks and felt again the unmistakable hum, low and rhythmic, like a distant turbine beating in sync with his own heartbeat. And when he stood, he noticed the birds had gone quiet, all of them, not a single chirp in the air, only the wind and that hum, and the sense he was being observed not from above but from the ground itself. He checked his wristwatch, 12:03 a.m. again, and turned quickly toward a shape by the fence line, but it was just a shadow, or maybe the edge of his imagination finally spilling into reality. Over the next few days, strange things began appearing on the property: wire strands in the hedgerow braided with an unnatural symmetry, small discs of charred earth spaced evenly along the tractor path, and on the morning of August 9th, Dana found 5 of her chickens dead, laid out side by side with surgical precision, no blood, no wounds, their eyes wide open like something had scared the soul out of them. Dana, now fully convinced something was happening her father wasn't ready to face aloud, reached out to a man she'd once met at a soil conference in Dodge City, Dr. Reuben Nils, an agricultural physicist and amateur anomaly tracker, who arrived under the pretense of doing grain moisture surveys but spent most of his visit scanning the southern fields with a device he called a portable VLF analyzer and asking unsettling questions about geomagnetic anomalies and frequency displacement events, which neither Walter nor Dana had heard before but sounded technical enough to silence the neighbors. Walter didn't like Reuben, too talkative, too confident, but when the man pulled out a thermographic photo showing a heat signature beneath the soil near the first circle, one that resembled a coiled helix 30 feet across and just 6 inches underground, he had no words, just took the photo and didn't return it. That night, Walter took the object from the Prince Albert tin and buried it under a cedar stump, not because he was done with it, but because part of him feared it was watching him back. 2 nights later, the hum intensified, so much that Dana, sleeping in her old bedroom upstairs, sat bolt upright at 12:03 a.m. with her nose bleeding and a high-pitched ring in her ears, while Walter stood on the porch in his boots and field jacket, eyes fixed on the sky where no stars shone and the clouds formed a perfect circle above the property, unmoving and unnaturally smooth like the underside of a massive saucer. Nothing fell, nothing landed, but in the days after, Walter stopped sleeping altogether, and the electricity in the farmhouse began acting up, lights flickering at 12:03, the microwave running on its own, static bursts through the old AM radio that seemed to form patterns or whispers, especially if left on after dark. One morning, Reuben Nils didn't show for his check-in call, and when Dana tried to contact him, his office said he'd taken an indefinite leave and left no forwarding number. His motel room in town was found untouched, belongings still there, car still in the lot, as if he'd vanished between one blink and the next. Dana finally called Sheriff Buckland, an old friend of her late mother's, who drove out in his patrol truck and walked the fields with Walter, boots crunching the stubble, asking soft questions in that quiet drawl of his until he saw the symbols, new ones, etched into the siding of the grain silo, faint but present, and looked Walter in the eyes and said, "You didn't do this, did you, Walt?" To which Walter just shook his head and replied, "No, but I think I invited it somehow." The sheriff didn't write a report, didn't take photos, just said, "I'll check in," and left. But over the next week, Walter noticed a rust-colored pickup truck parked by the feed store every time he went in, a stranger sitting in the cab with mirrored sunglasses and a CB antenna that hummed even when turned off. Walter didn't approach, didn't ask, because something told him the eyes watching now were no longer just from the sky but from within the town itself. The most terrifying moment came on August 17th, when Boyd, trying to fix a down fence post by the third circle, found a footprint, one single, deep impression in the dry Kansas soil, too long to be human, with 5 digits curved in a way no man could walk without breaking his ankle, and a faint residue of something silvery along the edges like powdered metal or dried coolant. He didn't say a word to Walter, just walked off the job and never came back, leaving only a note that read, "Sorry Walt, I ain't cut out for this kind of weird," and disappeared across county lines by sundown. That night, Walter locked every door, drew the blinds, and turned off every light in the house, waiting for the clock to hit 12:03. When it did, nothing happened, not at first, but then came the soft knock on the back door, 3 slow taps spaced 5 seconds apart. Even though the dog didn't bark and the motion sensor never triggered, Walter didn't open the door, didn't breathe, didn't move until sunrise, and when he finally looked out, the morning after the knock on the back door, Walter sat motionless in the kitchen with a lukewarm cup of coffee and his eyes trained on the linoleum as though reading something invisible beneath the stains and cracks of decades gone by, while Dana paced silently from window to window, drawing back curtains just enough to scan the horizon where the fields met the sky, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for anymore. Not movement, not light, not even people, but something else. Something she could only describe as a feeling pressing in from the outer edges of her senses, a kind of knowing that didn't have a source. The silence in the house had changed. It no longer felt like absence, but pressure, like air before a thunderstorm or the weight in your chest when you know a lie's been told and everyone's pretending not to notice. Walter finally spoke, voice low and sanded by exhaustion, "It's not just here anymore." And when Dana asked what he meant, he only said, "It's moving sideways," and refused to elaborate. But she saw the tears in his eyes and knew her father wasn't afraid for himself, he was afraid for everyone else. Later that day, she drove into town to pick up supplies, extra batteries, propane, bottled water, and 2 rolls of heavy-gauge copper wire, and couldn't help noticing the subtle shift in how people looked at her, the way conversation died when she entered the diner, the slow nods from folks who used to wave cheerfully but now kept their distance, like maybe they'd heard something, maybe they'd seen something, or maybe they were afraid whatever was happening out at the Brinley place might be contagious. At Miller's feed, old Martha handed her the receipt with a shaking hand and whispered, "I heard the radio say they've been seeing those lights down in Stafford, too, same time of night," and when Dana asked what lights, Martha leaned in and said, "The ones that don't blink," then quickly turned back to her register and didn't speak again. On her way home, Dana saw it, a shape in the sky, motionless and pale, not quite a cloud and not quite metallic, just hovering where the air shimmered slightly like heat over asphalt, and when she blinked, it was gone. That night, Walter went back out into the field alone, despite Dana's protests, and stood in the center of the original circle with a pocket watch clutched in one hand and the old metal object, the one he'd buried and then dug up again, in the other, waiting for whatever came at 12:03. The air grew cold, not crisp like autumn but wet and lifeless like the breath of a cave, and Walter's knees nearly buckled when the hum began, not in the ground this time, but in his skull, a vibration deep in his jaw that set his teeth aching and his vision blurring, and when the pocket watch hit 12:03, the world around him seemed to fold inward, not with light or sound, but with the absence of both, as if reality had flinched and briefly tried to hide from itself, for maybe 5 seconds. Walter could see nothing, just blackness layered over blackness, and then he saw them, 3 shapes standing at the edge of the circle, not quite human but not quite anything else either, tall and slim with limbs that bent wrong and skin that flickered like static over water, eyes like mirrors reflecting not light but memory, and one of them took a step forward without walking, appearing closer in an instant as if the space between them had simply vanished, and Walter didn't run, didn't scream, didn't pray, he just whispered, "Why me?" and felt the answer bloom inside his skull like a migraine made of voices, overlapping and toneless, saying, "You opened," over and over until the word meant nothing and everything all at once. When it ended, he was back in the field, alone, the object still in his hand, but the pocket watch was gone, and the ground beneath him was scorched in a perfect ring, no wider than a tractor tire but darker than fire had any right to be. The next morning, Dana found Walter in the recliner, wrapped in a quilt and shivering despite the heat, his eyes sunken and rimmed red, muttering a number again and again, 27.4. 27.4? 27.4 inch, until she finally slapped him to bring him back, and he looked up at her with such fear and relief that she nearly broke down right there. Later, Dana searched through his notebooks and found that same number scrawled in several places beside diagrams she didn't recognize, spirals within spirals, overlapping lines, and a symbol she couldn't describe except to say it felt wrong, like something not meant for human minds. She called every meteorologist, physicist, and engineer she could think of, but no one returned her calls, except for a man who left a voicemail saying, "Stop asking questions you don't want the answers to," in a voice that sounded synthesized, metallic, and distorted. The following night, Dana insisted Walter stay inside while she monitored the field from the old deer blind near the south fence, binoculars and a hunting rifle beside her, though she knew neither would matter if something truly came. At 12:03 the hum returned, but different this time, higher in pitch, accompanied by a flickering along the tree line like reflections from invisible water, and then a figure appeared not in the field, but in the blind with her, impossibly, silently, as if it had always been there and only now chose to be seen. Dana didn't scream, didn't move, didn't even breathe, and the figure didn't approach, didn't speak, just stared at her with those same mirror eyes before lifting a long arm and placing something in her lap, a folded piece of paper, crisp and white, with a handwritten phrase in her mother's cursive, "He is the vessel, you are the tether," and when she looked up again, the figure was gone and her watch said 12:04. She ran back to the house, hands shaking, and showed the note to Walter, who went deathly still and whispered, "She used to say that, when you were born, she said you anchored me," and then stood up and walked out the front door barefoot into the hayfield again, his steps slow and certain like he'd just remembered where he was meant to go. Dana followed him, calling his name, but Walter didn't stop. He walked straight to the fourth circle that had appeared overnight, this one much larger, maybe 40 feet across, with the grass inside woven so tight it looked like braided rope, and in the center sat the pocket watch, unmoving, hands frozen at exactly 12:03, the metal casing etched with the same symbol from his notes. Walter knelt, touched the watch, and whispered something so softly Dana couldn't hear. Then everything shifted. Again, the air cracking like it had lost pressure, colors dimming around the edges like film stock burning slowly, and the two of them were briefly alone in something that wasn't quite reality and wasn't quite dream. When it passed, they were back in the field, the circle gone, the pocket watch gone, and only the object remained, now glowing faintly blue and vibrating with a pulse that matched neither of their heartbeats. They took it inside, locked it in a safe under the stairs, and sat up the rest of the night without speaking, each knowing something had changed, not just in the field, not just in them, but in the very fabric of what they thought life on Earth meant. In the days that followed, Walter received 3 phone calls with no caller ID, each with silence on the other end except for a quiet ticking, and Dana found a series of footprints in the mud behind the barn, small, deep, and shaped like the one Boyd had seen. He hadn't slept right in days, and by the time Thursday rolled around, Mark felt like something inside him was coming loose. He spent most of the night sitting on the back porch, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes and staring out across the empty hayfield, where that strange spiral pattern had appeared and vanished days earlier like a fever dream. Since then, nothing had been normal. He could feel it in the way his animals acted, the cows skittish, the barn cats refusing to cross the yard, and in the stares he got from the few neighbors who still spoke to him. Most telling was what happened Tuesday night, a phone call at 3:17 a.m., no one on the other end, just a high-pitched static, followed by a deep metallic thud from the far end of the property, as if something had landed or been dropped. Mark didn't go investigate. He waited until morning, and by then, there was nothing out there except a single, perfectly round patch of singed earth in the middle of a soybean field he hadn't touched in weeks. That morning, he drove into town to speak to Joe Granger, the retired sheriff who used to fish with his father. Joe wasn't home, but his wife Mary said he'd been acting strange and drove out to his old patrol cabin 2 days ago, hadn't come back since. That alone wouldn't have been odd. Joe liked his whiskey and his space, but Mary's face told another story. Pale, tight-lipped, she leaned in and whispered something to Mark before sending him off. "They know you're looking." That stuck with him all day. He didn't know who they were, and he wasn't even sure what looking meant, but the fear in her voice was genuine. Back at the farm, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He shut the chickens in early and locked every window, even in the attic. That night, around 1 a.m., headlights appeared at the far edge of the dirt road. A black truck idled for maybe 20 seconds and then turned off its lights. Mark stood in the dark of his kitchen, heart pounding, watching through the blinds. He waited 10 minutes. Nothing. The truck was gone by sunrise. That afternoon, he found something tucked under the windshield wiper of his old Ford, a page from a ledger, brittle and stained, with coordinates written in pencil and the words, "Don't forget what your father saw." The handwriting was old, shaky. He drove out to the spot later that day, a dried-up creek bed near the back of the old Miller property, land no one had farmed in over 2 decades. Buried there, under a few loose stones and a rusted fence post, was a toolbox wrapped in burlap. Inside were 3 things: a rusted revolver with 1 bullet missing, a plastic ID card from the Department of Agriculture dated 1979, and a notebook full of crop reports with long strings of hand-drawn diagrams in the margins, all circles and angles, almost like constellations. Mark recognized the signature on the inside cover, D. Harlow. His father. But his father had never worked for the government, at least not that he ever said. The discovery shook something loose in Mark, not just fear but the realization that this had all happened before, maybe in pieces, in shadows, but whatever was happening now wasn't new. That night he didn't sleep. The sky was too quiet, and the wind felt wrong. At 2:11 a.m., his dog started barking and didn't stop for 5 minutes. When Mark went outside, flashlight in hand, there were new tire tracks in the dirt behind the barn. No lights, no sounds, but again, that feeling of being observed from somewhere just out of sight. He stayed outside till dawn, shotgun across his knees, waiting for something to show itself. Nothing did. But the sense of something drawing nearer, not just to him, but to the truth of what happened to his father, and maybe to Sheriff Joe too, grew heavier with every breath. It was no longer just his story. Whatever this was, it had been buried in this town for decades. And it wasn't done yet. By the time Saturday morning crept in, the air on the farm felt different, heavier somehow, like it had absorbed all the silence of the past few nights and was pressing it down onto Mark's shoulders. The fields looked ordinary, but he knew better. Every inch of his land now felt like a map of questions. The spirals, the tire tracks, the burnt patches, they weren't isolated events anymore, they were pieces of something constructed long ago. Mark didn't tell anyone where he was going that morning. He filled the truck with gas, packed the revolver in the glove compartment, and brought the notebook he'd found buried behind the Miller property. His first stop was the county archive office. He'd been there a few times in the past, but never with the determination he carried now. The clerk, an old man with thick glasses named Reggie, looked up and seemed surprised to see him. "Looking for ghosts, Mark?" he asked half-jokingly. Mark didn't smile. "Looking for my father." Reggie blinked, then led him to a back room where old property surveys and agricultural records were stored. Mark spread out the notebook, matched diagrams to satellite photos from the late 1970s, and slowly began to piece together something that looked like a pattern, not crop rotations or irrigation lines, but precise land use changes, spaced every 5 years, centered around properties that had all changed hands under strange circumstances: foreclosure, fire, disappearance. Among the names was the farm once owned by Sheriff Joe's uncle, and another belonging to a man named Virgil Beasley, who'd vanished in 1983 and whose case was labeled unsolved, presumed drowned after a fishing trip gone wrong. But the strangest name was near the center of the pattern: Harlow. His father. According to the county records, David Harlow had been listed not just as a landowner, but as a field agent contracted by a now-defunct division of the Department of Agriculture that specialized in soil pattern monitoring. The division was shut down in 1986, the same year his father reportedly had a breakdown and locked himself in the barn for 2 days straight before burning half his crop. Mark had been too young to understand it then. Now it made his skin crawl. Reggie, sensing something deeper at play, asked if he was in trouble. "Not yet," Mark said. On the way out, a woman he didn't recognize handed him a sealed envelope. No return address. Inside was a photo, black and white, slightly bent, of Sheriff Joe standing beside David Harlow in front of the very cabin Joe had driven 2 days earlier. The back of the photo had one line written in faded ink: "Ask him about July 12th. Mark drove straight to that cabin, hidden deep in the woods near an old logging trail. The front door was ajar, but the place seemed untouched, save for a dusty lantern flickering in the corner and the faint smell of kerosene. Joe was inside, sitting at the table, gun on his lap, eyes bloodshot. "I knew you'd come," he said, not startled. Mark sat down and didn't speak. Joe started talking like he hadn't stopped in days. He told Mark that in July of 1984, something happened on David Harlow's land, something that involved men from the government, drilling equipment, and a night that ended with gunshots and fire. Joe had helped cover it up. "They said it was for national security," he whispered. I believed them. But afterward, people started disappearing, not just from town, but from memory. Virgil Beasley. An assistant named Janet Flannery. Even a kid named Tom Nelson who used to help on Harlow's farm. Their names were removed from public records, school yearbooks, even church logs. Joe said he kept a copy of a report, something David had given him the night before he went silent, but it had been stolen from his house 2 weeks ago. "They know you're digging," Joe said. "They'll try to stop you, same as they did him." Mark left the cabin with more questions than answers. That night, he walked the perimeter of his land, flashlight in one hand, revolver in the other. In the barn, he found a fresh footprint in the dust, not his. In the mailbox the next morning, a single sheet of paper, soaked by dew, with a list of coordinates and 4 words: "Follow the line north." He plotted the locations on the map. They formed a straight path from his farm through 3 others, all now abandoned, leading into the forest where the old water tower stood. And suddenly it all made sense, not the why, but the where. Whatever his father had hidden, whatever these patterns meant, it ended at the tower. Mark packed his bag, checked his ammo, and looked at the farmhouse one last time. He knew he might not come back. The walk toward the water tower was long and silent, a slow march through tall grass and thorn-covered undergrowth that seemed untouched in decades. Mark followed the plotted line from the map, crossing overgrown fence posts and rusted irrigation pipes, moving from one abandoned property to the next, each more desolate than the last. By the time he reached the edge of the forest, the sky was low and gray, and the light filtered through the trees in broken patches like scattered secrets. The old tower loomed ahead, skeletal and rust-streaked, the metal stairs crumbling at the joints, surrounded by an eerie quiet that pressed into the lungs. He found the hatch at the base half covered in moss and nearly rusted shut. With effort, he pried it open and crawled down into the cold, damp chamber beneath it. What he expected, he couldn't say, maybe more field notes, maybe old government files, or some buried evidence left behind by his father. But what he found was stranger than that: a long, narrow room lined with file cabinets, empty metal lockers, and a single wooden desk covered in plastic sheeting. On the desk lay a thick binder labeled HSP Phase 3, Field Convergence Reports, Restricted. Inside were pages of coordinates, maps, grain pattern diagrams, and heat signature overlays, some marked with red circles and the names of farms long since raised or sold off. Among the pages was a photograph he'd never seen before: his father, younger than Mark had ever known him, standing with a group of 5 other men in front of a black trailer mounted with odd antennae. Below it, a caption: "Field Test, Clear Ridge, July 12, 1984. Mark kept flipping. Taped to the back page was a cassette labeled simply Final. He didn't have a player on him, but he recognized the initials: Arthur Hensley, the scientist his father used to mention in hushed tones. Mark took everything, loaded it into his backpack, and climbed back out, but the moment he stepped into the clearing, he saw the glint of something behind the trees, not light, not metal, but the reflection of glass, binoculars. Someone was watching. He ducked back, circled the tower, and spotted a car parked far off along the edge of the woods. A figure stepped out, tall, with a long coat and a flat-brimmed hat, holding what looked like a radio. Mark didn't wait. He took a wide loop through the woods and made it back to his truck by nightfall. Back at the house, he locked all the doors and unboxed his father's old tape player from the attic. The recording was damaged, distorted by age and moisture, but parts of it came through. "This is Arthur Hensley. If you're hearing this, I've failed. The project was never about soil. Not weather. Not crops. It was about response. Signal response. Stimulus and control. They used the fields because no one questions the shape of corn. They don't see the patterns, not really. But your father did. There was a long pause, then coughing. He tried to warn people. He tried to bury it. He thought he could outsmart them. But they took him. Not killed. Taken. Rewritten. The tape crackled and ended. Mark sat in silence, the sound of the old house creaking like breathing. He went to the old barn, where his father once sealed himself in, and found something he hadn't noticed before, a small concrete slab hidden beneath hay and rotten boards. Under it, a rusted metal case. Inside, a ledger. His father's handwriting. Not madness. Not delusion. But a careful, year-by-year log of tests, phone calls, field anomalies, and repeated mentions of one name, the signalman. The last entry was dated a week before his disappearance. It read, "If anyone finds this, follow the noise, not the silence. The silence is theirs." Mark didn't sleep that night. In the morning, he found tire tracks near his truck that hadn't been there before. The notebook from the county archive was missing. The only remaining page was one with a hand-drawn map, not of land, but of sound frequencies and their geographic effect. The signal. As the days passed, Mark realized what he had, not just evidence, but a key. To what, he wasn't sure. Maybe to what had driven his father mad. Maybe to what had taken him. And maybe, just maybe, to bringing the truth into daylight. But he also knew the cost. People would come. Files would vanish. Records would change. So he copied everything, hid the originals in 3 places across the county, and mailed a duplicate to a journalist friend in Chicago. And then he waited. For a knock. For a car that wouldn't start. For someone to ask him, casually, what he thought about weather. The truth was real now. He'd seen it. And the land had never been quiet, he just hadn't learned to listen. Not until it was too late.